There is a fear so profound it reshapes the soul, a fear not of an end, but of being forgotten, erased from existence. What happens when this fear takes hold and twists a person's mind into something unrecognizable? This is the story of a man consumed by his own dread, whose desperate quest for eternal life created a shadow that still lingers. As we unravel this mystery, prepare to see beyond the legend and question what it truly means to face the unknown. What if the greatest horror is not what awaits us after life, but what we become trying to avoid it? In a world that often feels cold and unwelcoming, some begin their journey surrounded by shadows they cannot escape. Our story's beginning takes place in such a place, where loneliness and rejection were constants, carving deep marks in a young soul. This was a boy who grew up invisible, overlooked by those around him, carrying an invisible burden heavier than most could understand. The environment he inhabited was unforgiving. A place where warmth was scarce, and the yearning to be seen was often met with silence. It was in this void that the first seeds of a profound fear took root, the fear not of an ending, but of becoming irrelevant, forgotten, erased by time. His psyche, fragile and unguarded, began to seek refuge in control and superiority as a shield against the uncertainty of existence. The world outside was unpredictable, but if he could command it, perhaps he could outrun the deep, unsettling void inside. This need to assert dominance was less about cruelty and more about survival. Psychologists would recognize this as the emergence of a coping mechanism, where trauma and neglect nurture a fragile self-esteem, blossoming into an obsessive quest for power and recognition. Narcissism in its most desperate form is often a mask for an aching vulnerability, a psychological fortress built to keep fear at bay. Yet, beneath this facade, the boy's inner turmoil churned, unseen by those around him. But there was something darker brewing beneath the surface, a shadow that would soon stretch far beyond the boy's control. Something that no one around him could predict or understand. And so, the story of this transformation begins, setting in motion a path none could foresee. But there was something that no one saw coming. The turning point came like a quiet storm, subtle at first but impossible to ignore once it broke. It wasn't a single dramatic event but a series of small fractures that, together, shattered the fragile world the boy had built around himself. Rejection, isolation, and betrayal, each one like a silent wound, invisible to the outside but bleeding within. These experiences converged into a moment of rupture that forever altered the course of his life. The boy who once dreamed of acceptance found himself standing alone at the edge of a vast emotional abyss. This rupture awakened a fierce internal conflict, a battle between hope and despair that played out beneath the surface of his thoughts. On one side lay the yearning to be understood, loved, and embraced by a world that had so often turned its back on him. On the other, a growing conviction took hold. That the only way to survive was to become untouchable, to construct walls so high and cold that no one could breach them. Vulnerability was no longer a risk worth taking, it was a threat to his very existence. The innocence he once held was replaced by a ruthless determination to protect himself at all costs. Psychologists describe such moments as critical junctures where trauma ignites defense mechanisms that shape personality and behavior. The boy's mind began to weave a complex tapestry of coping strategies, denial, dissociation, and an obsessive need for control. These defenses were not signs of weakness but survival tools, allowing him to navigate a world that felt hostile and unpredictable. He learned to suppress his true feelings, hiding behind a mask of confidence and arrogance, but beneath the surface, the fear and pain never fully disappeared. As he grew older, this internal struggle found expression in his relationships and actions. The young man pushed away those who sought closeness, fearing that intimacy would only lead to more pain. Instead, he exerted dominance in subtle and overt ways, manipulating situations, controlling outcomes, and building an empire of influence where he was no longer vulnerable. His world became a chessboard, each move calculated to maintain his power and keep the shadows at bay. But this power came with a cost, loneliness deepened, and empathy faded, replaced by a cold rationality. The environment around him mirrored this change, responding with suspicion and fear. Friends became distant, allies wary, and the boy who once sought connection now found himself isolated by the very fortress he built. Yet, within this isolation, the foundation for something greater, and darker, was quietly being laid. The transformation was far from over. Beneath the surface, a storm was gathering strength, and the true nature of his evolution had yet to reveal itself. And it was at this fragile, volatile moment, when the boy stood on the edge of his former self and the unknown, that everything began to crumble. The cracks that had formed long ago widened, threatening to swallow not only his past but the very essence of who he was becoming. The transformation was no longer a subtle shift but a solidification, a forging of a new identity in the crucible of fear and ambition. The young man's mind had become a labyrinth of strategies and justifications, a fortress built not just for defense, but for conquest. Every thought was a calculated step toward securing his place in a world that had once rejected him. This was no longer the fragile boy who once longed to be seen. It was someone reshaped by pain into something far more complex, something both fascinating and unsettling. Within this evolving mind, patterns emerged, repetitive thoughts and behaviors that reflected a relentless pursuit of control. He began to embrace a philosophy where the ends justified the means, where emotions were tools to manipulate, and where power was the ultimate truth. This new mindset was supported by a growing detachment from empathy and a heightened sense of self-importance. The line between reality and his internal narrative blurred, as he convinced himself that his actions were not just necessary but righteous. Psychologically, this stage can be seen as the crystallization of narcissistic traits mixed with obsessive tendencies. The individual develops a distorted self-image, combined with an unyielding belief in their own exceptionalism. Scientific studies on personality disorders highlight how such a mindset fosters not only grandiosity but also an acute sensitivity to perceived threats, a constant vigilance that drives the person to eliminate any challenge to their authority, often before it even appears. Inside his mind, this evolution was a silent storm, a dance between brilliance and darkness. His thoughts became like a chess grandmaster's. Anticipating moves, predicting reactions, and controlling outcomes with cold precision. Those around him noticed his change, a chilling calm replaced any hint of vulnerability. Conversations turned into power plays, and every interaction was a test of dominance. He spoke rarely but with conviction, each word carefully chosen to assert control or seed doubt. But the most unsettling part of this transformation was what remained hidden. The void inside, the core of fear and uncertainty that no amount of power could fully erase. It was a secret he guarded fiercely, the one part of himself that no one else was allowed to see. And yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly invincible persona, the seeds of fragility still lingered, waiting, watching, and threatening to unravel everything. And just as this new darkness seemed complete, a revelation shattered the illusion. The real monster was not the power he wielded, but the part of himself that was still asleep, dormant yet waiting to rise. The true challenge was yet to come, the true monster was still asleep. The crossing came without spectacle, almost imperceptible to anyone watching from the outside. It was not a dramatic moment of crisis, but a quiet, resolute step, a subtle shift in the landscape of his mind that changed everything. Up until this point, the young man had been grappling with pain, fear, and the fragile threads of hope. But now, with a cold clarity born from countless calculated reflections, he chose to discard those old remnants of vulnerability. It was a conscious decision to embrace a new reality, one where his personal rules overshadowed every societal norm. This was the moment when his world no longer resembled the chaotic, unpredictable place of his youth. Instead, it transformed into a game, a grand, strategic chessboard, where every person and event was a piece to be manipulated, moved, or sacrificed. Morality became relative, a flexible concept that bent and twisted to justify the pursuit of power and survival. Empathy and compassion, once flickers of light in the darkness, were eclipsed by a cold pragmatism. He told himself that this was necessary, that the old ways had failed him, and only by mastering the rules could he ensure he would never be vulnerable again. Inside his mind, a relentless internal dialogue raged. He wrestled with lingering doubts and justifications, weaving intricate rationales to silence any whisper of guilt or regret. What if the world's standards are just illusions created by those who hold power, he pondered. What if the very ideas of good and evil are tools for control, not truth? These questions fueled a dangerous conviction, inviting viewers to step inside the maze of his thinking and confront the unsettling possibility that he might be, in his own way, right. This transformation did not erase his humanity, but it reshaped it, layering it with armor forged from disillusionment and ambition. His capacity to see others as anything but obstacles or tools deepened, yet beneath that hardened exterior remained a fragile core of pain he refused to acknowledge, even to himself. It was this tension, between the ruthless exterior and the wounded interior, that gave his actions their strange complexity. Philosophically, the point of no return challenges the audience to reconsider simplistic notions of villainy. The line between right and wrong blurs when survival demands harsh choices, and the young man's story becomes a mirror reflecting the fragile ethics of a world that can be both unforgiving and unjust. His choices force us to ask, when does protection turn into obsession? When does justified self-preservation cross into something darker? And can anyone truly walk back once the threshold is crossed? The consequences of this crossing extend far beyond himself. Relationships fracture under the weight of his transformation. Allies become wary, and even enemies recognize the cold finality of the man he has become. The young man's vision expands, but so does his isolation. The world he shapes is one of control and dominance, but it is also a lonely kingdom, built on calculated moves and empty victories. And then, as silence falls over this turning point, a haunting question lingers in the air: what if this path can never be undone? What if there is no going back from this place? It is a question without easy answers, one that unsettles the foundation of the story and sets the stage for the darkest chapters to come. At this stage, the complexity of the mind behind the darkness becomes clearer. What might appear as chaos or irrationality from the outside actually follows a chilling internal logic. The young man's actions, which once seemed driven by raw emotion, now reveal themselves as deliberate calculations grounded in psychological mechanisms and cognitive patterns. His relentless pursuit of control and permanence is not a lapse in reason but the expression of an intricate survival strategy crafted over years of pain and rejection. Psychologists often describe this phenomenon as the interplay between narcissistic traits and obsessive control. The desire to avoid vulnerability, to stave off the fear of loss or disappearance, transforms into a rigid, sometimes ruthless, system of self-preservation. The individual creates mental anchors. Rituals, beliefs, and behaviors that stabilize their fragile sense of identity. In the young man's case, this translated into a fixation on power and dominance, where every move is carefully designed to protect that fragile core from being shattered again. Scientific studies on trauma and personality development explain how early adverse experiences can mold an individual's brain wiring, affecting their ability to regulate emotions and empathize with others. This neurological shift often results in heightened vigilance, distorted perceptions of threat, and a tendency to manipulate surroundings to create a sense of safety. Such adaptations might seem extreme, but from the perspective of the individual, they are logical responses to an environment perceived as hostile and unforgiving. His methodical approach to his goals mirrors these scientific insights. Every relationship is weighed for potential gain or risk. Every emotion is either a tool to wield or a weakness to conceal. Even his moments of apparent calm conceal a mind constantly analyzing, predicting, and strategizing. The coldness seen by others is not a void but a fortress, built to maintain control and avoid any crack that might lead to vulnerability. In this context, the young man's story parallels real-world cases where individuals, shaped by trauma and profound fear, develop intricate defense mechanisms that outsiders mistake for cruelty or madness. Yet, behind the mask lies a calculated mind functioning with precision, a mind that understands the cost of weakness and chooses to wield power as a shield. This realization reframes the horror. It is not a product of irrationality or chaos, but of cold, deliberate calculation. It was not madness. It was cold calculation. This chilling insight forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that destruction can follow a carefully reasoned path, driven not by impulse but by a deep, unsettling logic. As this chapter closes, a new layer of understanding emerges, revealing that the young man's story is not just one of darkness, but also a complex study of human psychology and survival. The line between horror and reason blurs, leaving the audience to grapple with the paradox of a mind both broken and brilliantly strategic, a mind that, despite everything, never lost sight of its goal. After the storm of transformation and relentless pursuit, what remains is a world profoundly altered, a landscape shaped by the echoes of a mind that refused to accept limitation. The young man's journey did not end with his own fate alone, it left traces that reached far beyond, influencing those around him and the very fabric of the environment he touched. His legacy is one of disruption, a ripple effect of power, fear, and fractured connections. This legacy is not a simple tale of defeat or victory. Instead, it is a complex blend of influence and consequence, where the lines between harm and protection blur. The world around him is both stronger and more fragile, a paradox born from his actions. His story serves as a mirror reflecting the shadowy parts of human nature, the relentless desire for control, the fear of insignificance, and the lengths one might go to avoid both. Philosophically, his legacy poses a question that lingers long after the story ends: who are we to judge the choices made in the crucible of fear and ambition? His actions challenge conventional morality, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that survival often demands sacrifices, and that the path to power is rarely clean or simple. It invites reflection on the nature of judgment, forgiveness, and the complexities that shape human decisions. Though the story appears to close, a subtle hint remains, a suggestion that this is not the end, but perhaps a new beginning. The cycles of fear, ambition, and transformation may continue, carried forward by others who face similar shadows within themselves. The young man may no longer be present, but the forces he set in motion persist, suggesting that the myth is not fully written. This closing thought leaves the viewer with a chilling contemplation. What if the legacy of such a mind is not a singular tale, but an ongoing narrative echoing through generations? It is a reminder that some stories never truly end, they evolve, transform, and find new forms in unexpected places.